Ancient records hold stories of lakes that vanished without a trace. This is a journey through 30 of history's most puzzling lake disappearances, where you will uncover the hidden forces that can make an entire body of water simply cease to exist. We will see how a legendary garden lost its water source and why a desert once teeming with life turned to sand. By the end, you will see the deep connection between vanishing waters and the fate of civilizations. What forgotten catastrophe lies behind the most enduring flood myth? How could a city built on a lake watch its very foundation dry up? These are not just tales of loss, but of human resilience in the face of a shifting world. What do you think drives a society when its most vital resource disappears? The story of vanishing lakes begins with one of the ancient world's most celebrated marvels. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were described as a breathtaking mountain of greenery built for a homesick queen, a lush paradise rising from the desert plains. Ancient accounts, particularly from Greek historians like Strabo, spend less time on the plants and more on the engineering miracle that sustained them. They wrote of complex screw pumps lifting water from the Euphrates River, of tiered terraces with intricate channels ensuring every level was perpetually moist. This was not just a garden, it was a monumental feat of hydraulic engineering. Central to this system, many scholars believe, was a large ornamental lake or a massive reservoir at the garden's base, a shimmering centerpiece that reflected the towering greenery above. This lake was the heart of the entire wonder, the crucial holding tank that made the impossible garden possible. Then, according to some fragmented records and local lore, the heart stopped beating. The water vanished. The great reservoir upon which the entire spectacle depended is said to have gone dry. One prevailing theory points to seismic activity, a powerful earthquake that could have fractured the underground water tables or collapsed the intricate canals feeding the lake. Another suggests a more gradual but equally deadly shift, as the mighty Euphrates River itself changed its course over centuries, abandoning the channels that once fed Babylon's grandeur. The lake's disappearance would have been a death sentence for the gardens. The pumps would have grown empty, the channels would have become dusty trenches, and that mountain of life would have withered into a skeletal mound of earth and dead roots. This leads to a fascinating and enduring mystery, the debate over whether the gardens were ever real at all. Could the legend of the Hanging Gardens itself be a story born from a lost lake? Some archaeologists propose that the vivid descriptions passed down through history are not of a garden, but of a sophisticated royal irrigation project, an artificial oasis that later observers romanticized. When its water source failed and the green faded from memory, all that remained was the echo of its splendor, a story so powerful it became one of the seven wonders. The disappearance of that water didn't just kill a garden, it may have transformed engineering into myth, leaving us to wonder if we are remembering a place that ever truly existed, or simply the ghost of a lake that once was. The fate of a garden is one thing, but the fate of an entire civilization is another. Far to the east of Babylon, in what is now Pakistan, another ancient society mastered water on an even grander scale. The Indus Valley civilization, with its crown jewel of Mohenjo-Daro, thrived for centuries. This was not a city of pyramids or ziggurats, but a marvel of stunning practicality. Archaeologists have uncovered a grid of straight streets, sophisticated drainage systems, and homes with indoor bathrooms, all pointing to a society obsessed with order and hygiene. Central to this urban plan was a massive, man-made structure known simply as the Great Bath. This carefully engineered tank, lined with waterproof bricks and tar, was likely more than a ritual site. Many experts believe it was the heart of a complex public water system, a central reservoir that could have supplied the city. For a civilization that rose in a river valley, water was not just life, it was the foundation of their entire social order. Then the foundation crumbled. The city was abandoned, and for millennia the reasons remained a profound mystery. Modern science, however, is beginning to read the clues left in the dirt. Geological surveys and sediment cores drilled from the surrounding plains tell a story of dramatic environmental change. The evidence points to a powerful and likely sudden shift in the very landscape that gave the civilization its name. One leading theory suggests a catastrophic tectonic event, a massive earthquake that literally changed the course of the mighty Indus River. Imagine the lifeblood of your entire world simply moving away, leaving its old channels to bake in the sun. Another, more gradual theory points to climate change, a shift in monsoon patterns that led to extended droughts and the slow creep of desertification. The Great Reservoir at Mohenjo-Daro would have been the first casualty. Without the replenishing flow from the river or consistent rains, that vast tank would have emptied. The intricate drains and public wells would have fallen silent. The empty basin of the Great Bath, once a symbol of communal life, would have become a stark monument to a broken system. This was not a single bad season, it was the unraveling of an ecological contract. When the water vanished, it took with it the agriculture that fed the people, the sanitation that kept them healthy, and ultimately the very reason for the city to exist. The citizens of Mohenjo-Daro did not just abandon a city, they were forced to abandon a way of life perfectly adapted to a world that no longer existed. Their disappearance stands as a haunting lesson in how fragile even the most advanced society can be when its relationship with water is severed. The transition from a vanished city to a vanished deity is a startling one. Our third disappearance takes us from the dry plains of the Indus Valley to the sun-baked coast of North Africa, where a lake was not just a resource but a divine home. Ancient Greek writers spoke with awe of Lake Tritonis, a vast inland sea in what is now Libya. In their myths, this was no ordinary body of water. It was the legendary birthplace of the goddess Athena, who is said to have sprung fully armed from its shores. The heroic Argonauts, on their quest for the Golden Fleece, were famously driven off course and into the lake's labyrinthine channels, needing divine intervention to find their way back to the Mediterranean. For the Greeks, Tritonis was a place of mystery and power, a tangible anchor for their stories in a distant, real landscape. The historian Herodotus, always keen to separate rumor from report, traveled to the region in the 5th century before the Common Era. He recorded the accounts of local Berber tribes who described a massive saltwater lake that was already in a state of dramatic change. Herodotus wrote that the lake was shrinking, its waters receding to reveal strange, petrified forests beneath the surface, a haunting image of an ecosystem transforming before human eyes. By the time Roman geographers mapped the area centuries later, the Great Lake Tritonis was largely gone, replaced by a chain of smaller, seasonal salt flats. So what happened to a lake sacred enough to birth a goddess? The answer lies in the relentless mechanics of the desert. The primary culprit was likely the slow, monumental migration of sand dunes. Imagine a wall of sand pushed by prevailing winds over decades and centuries, gradually blocking the narrow inlets that connected Lake Tritonis to the sea. Cut off from its source, the vast basin began to evaporate under the African sun, concentrating its salts into a crusty wasteland. This process, known as the formation of a sebkha or salt pan, can still be seen in the region today at places like Sebkha El Mela. Compounding this was likely tectonic subsidence, the land itself subtly sinking, which would have accelerated the water's dispersal and made recovery impossible. The disappearance of Tritonis was more than an ecological event. It was a geographical upheaval that rewrote human maps. The lake had once been a crucial inland harbor, a sheltered shortcut for ancient Phoenician and Greek traders moving along the perilous African coast. Its loss forced a complete recalculation of trade routes, pushing commerce entirely out to the open, dangerous sea. For the local Berber tribes, the change was existential. Their world was literally drying up around them. The loss of this major water body would have disrupted fishing, altered local climate patterns, and scattered populations who depended on its shores. The mythical home of Athena became a barren flat, a place where you could walk across what sailors once feared as a divine maze. This disappearance shows us how a single geographical change can echo through layers of human experience, from the heights of mythology and international trade down to the daily survival of a local community, leaving behind only salt and stories. Greece holds a different kind of vanished lake story, one where human ingenuity and natural catastrophe are tangled together. In the fertile region of Boeotia, surrounded by low mountains, lay Lake Kopais. In its natural state, it was a vast, shallow expanse, the largest lake in ancient Greece, but it was also a temperamental neighbor. Every winter, rains and mountain runoff would cause it to flood dramatically, swallowing farmland and villages, only to recede partially in the summer, leaving behind marshland and fertile silt. This cycle of abundance and threat defined life in the region for centuries. Ancient legends spoke of a monstrous creature, a serpent or a dragon that haunted the lake, a personification of its destructive, unpredictable floods. But then something changed. The lake was tamed. By the late 2nd millennium before the Common Era, the Mycenaean civilization, and specifically a group known as the Minions, undertook one of antiquity's most staggering engineering projects. They did not just build canals, they carved a network of massive underground tunnels known as catavothers through the surrounding limestone. These were not simple ditches, but carefully graded, stone-lined channels designed to capture the floodwaters and funnel them through the bedrock and out to the sea. The scale was breathtaking, a hydraulic masterstroke that effectively drained the lake, converting its bed into thousands of acres of the richest farmland in Greece. For generations, this was celebrated as a pure triumph of human will over nature. Yet, earlier geological clues whisper a more complex tale. The Boeotian Basin is classic karst landscape, a porous limestone sponge riddled with natural fissures, sinkholes, and subterranean rivers. Modern geologists point to strong evidence that long before the Minions ever broke ground, a massive natural drainage event likely occurred. A section of the limestone ceiling over an underground water channel could have catastrophically collapsed like a plug being pulled from a giant bathtub. Such an event would have caused a sudden, terrifying drop in the lake's level, perhaps even a partial disappearance overnight. Imagine witnessing that, a vast inland sea roaring away into the earth. This natural calamity may have been the true seed of the lake's legendary monster. The ancient Greeks had a name for the spirit of such a terrifying, earth-swallowing event, Tritonis. Later myth recast him as an oracular deity, but his origins are darkly chthonic, linked directly to caves and the underworld. It is compelling to think that the myth of Tritonis began as an attempt to explain a real, witnessed trauma, a lake being devoured by the ground itself. The brilliant Minion engineering, then, might not have been the first act of drainage, but the final one. They may have discovered a landscape already partially drained by nature, a system of sinkholes and channels laid bare, and then applied their genius to complete the job and make it permanent. The story of Lake Kopais is not a simple before and after, but a layered puzzle where a natural disaster may have inspired both terrifying myth and the blueprint for one of humanity's first great victories over water. From the engineered plains of Greece, we journey to a landscape transformed on a truly continental scale. Today, the Sahara is a sea of sand, a symbol of absolute aridity stretching for millions of square miles. But this was not always so. Between roughly 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. Monsoon rain swept much farther north, painting the desert with grasslands, forests, and most astonishingly, vast networks of lakes and rivers. Ancient rock art, etched into now barren cliffs, provides undeniable proof. These galleries, left by prehistoric peoples, are not filled with images of camels, but of hippopotamuses wallowing in water, of crocodiles basking on shores, and of humans swimming and fishing. This was a world of water. The greatest of these vanished bodies was Lake Mega-Chad, a freshwater sea that at its peak was larger than the Caspian is today, covering an area of over 150,000 square miles. Its ancient shorelines, visible from space, trace a ghostly bathtub ring around modern, shrinking Lake Chad, a mere puddle in comparison. The entire region was a thriving ecosystem, supporting not just wildlife but complex human societies that followed the rains and the game. Then the climate changed, beginning around 5,000 years ago, a gradual but relentless shift in the Earth's orbital pattern, known as the North African monsoon, began to weaken. The rains retreated southward. Year by year, century by century, the green faded. The lakes, deprived of their lifeblood, began a slow, agonizing death. They did not drain catastrophically, but evaporated under a strengthening sun, shrinking and fracturing into smaller, saltier pools before vanishing entirely into the dust. For the people living through this millennia-long drought, it was an existential crisis written in the landscape itself. While direct written records from the earliest Saharan peoples are lost, we see the echoes in later cultures. Ancient Egyptian texts, for instance, speak of the western deserts as a place of spirits and the dead, a formidable barrier. This cultural memory may stem from a time when their ancestors witnessed the lush lands to their west withering into an impassable wasteland, a transformation so profound it became mythologized as the realm of the afterlife. Farther west, the formidable Garamontes of the Libyan desert, who flourished from around 500 before the Common Era, provide a direct archaeological record of adaptation. They became masters of a disappearing world by tapping the last remnants of the ancient lakes, the fossil water trapped deep underground. They constructed ingenious underground tunnels called fagaras to mine this prehistoric rainfall, creating a network of oases in the desolate sea of sand. Their entire civilization was a brilliant, desperate answer to the disappearance of surface water, a testament to human resilience in the face of a drying continent. The loss of the Saharan lakes was not a single event, but a slow-motion cataclysm that reshaped human history, scattering populations, birthing new desert kingdoms, and turning a vibrant green world into the haunting, empty expanse we know today. What does it mean for a civilization to be built upon the ghost of a lake? The slow death of a continent stands in stark contrast to the sudden, engineered fate of a lake at the heart of an empire. Centuries after the Sahara turned to dust on the other side of the world, the Aztecs built their magnificent capital, Tenochtitlan, not beside a lake but within one. The city was a marvel of hydraulic ambition, a grid of canals and chinampas or floating gardens constructed upon the shallow waters of Lake Texcoco. For the Aztecs, the lake was not a threat to be drained but a divine foundation to be mastered. Their entire society, from its food supply to its spiritual identity, was woven into the fabric of the water. Spanish conquistadors would later write in awe of a city that gleamed like a vision, its temples reflected in the canals, a Venice of the New World. Yet, long before European arrival, Aztec codices and oral histories hint at a more precarious relationship with their aquatic home. These sources speak not of constant abundance, but of terrifying periods when the life-giving waters betrayed them. There are accounts of extreme droughts that caused the lake to recede dramatically, exposing cracked mudflats where canoes once glided. Other, more cryptic passages describe sudden losses, where sections of the lake seemed to drain away rapidly, as if a plug had been pulled from the basin's floor. Geologists studying the Valley of Mexico point to a likely culprit for these sudden disappearances, the volatile geology of the region itself. The valley is a closed basin ringed by volcanoes and sitting on highly porous, fractured bedrock. A powerful earthquake common in the area could have opened new fissures in the lakebed, creating massive sinkholes that swallowed water into underground aquifers almost overnight. Similarly, volcanic activity from nearby peaks like Popocatépetl could have shifted groundwater flows or spewed ash that clogged springs, starving the lake from below. For a people whose world literally floated, such an event would have been apocalyptic. A city built on water cannot survive its foundation vanishing. This is where history and belief merge into a powerful legend. The Aztec patron god Huitzilopochtli, the deity of sun and war, was said to demand constant sacrifice to keep the sun moving across the sky, and crucially, to prevent the world from falling into darkness and chaos. Scholars now see a possible environmental root to this terrifying theology. In a land where water could disappear without warning, the most logical explanation for the Aztecs was divine displeasure. The failure of the lake, the droughts that withered their crops, these were not random natural events. They were signs that Huitzilopochtli's hunger was not being satisfied. The practice of ritual sacrifice, therefore, can be interpreted as a desperate attempt at hydrological management, a plea to a cosmic force to maintain the delicate balance of their world. By offering the most precious resource, human life, they believed they were ensuring the flow of an even more precious one, water. The Spanish, of course, would later physically drain the lake, a deliberate act of conquest to dismantle the Aztec world. But the codices suggest the lake had threatened to vanish on its own long before, forcing the Aztecs to develop a profound, and to our eyes horrifying, spiritual technology to hold their liquid world together. Their entire civilization was a negotiation with a lake that was always on the verge of disappearing. A palace built for a view of water may one day overlook only dust. On the sun-drenched island of Crete, the grand Minoan palace of Phaistos stands sentinel on a hill, its sweeping vistas now taking in the vast, fertile Massara plain. Yet geological corings tell a different story of this landscape. Layers of sediment beneath the olive groves reveal ancient lakebed deposits, evidence that a substantial, shallow lake once shimmered here, its waters likely reflecting the palace walls. For the Minoans, masters of trade and sophisticated art, this lake would have been more than scenery. It was a strategic asset, a source of irrigation, fish, and perhaps even a defensive moat for the plains below. The mystery is not just that it vanished, but when and why. The Minoan script Linear A remains undeciphered, locking away direct accounts. However, later Greek myths that echo Minoan origins may hold clues. There are persistent tales of a great, fertile plain on Crete that was lost or cursed, stories that speak of abundance giving way to barrenness. Could these be distant cultural memories of the lake's disappearance? The timing points to a cataclysm that reshaped the ancient world. Around the year 1600 before the Common Era, the volcanic island of Thera, north of Crete, exploded in one of the largest eruptions in human history. The event was apocalyptic. Tsunamis, perhaps hundreds of feet high, would have crashed onto the northern coasts of Crete, devastating ports and palaces. But the impact on the Massara Lake on the southern side of the island would have been more subtle and ultimately more permanent. The colossal ash cloud would have blotted out the sun for years, triggering a volcanic winter. Global temperatures plummeted and rainfall patterns went haywire. For Crete, this likely meant a sudden, severe drought. The lake at Phaistos, dependent on consistent seasonal rains, would have begun to evaporate rapidly under the ash-dimmed sky. Furthermore, the titanic seismic shocks from the eruption could have fractured the local limestone bedrock, opening new underground channels that drained the lake from below. The Minoans at Phaistos would have witnessed a slow-motion disaster. First, the sky grew dark and the air cold. Then, the life-giving lake they depended on began to shrink, season after season, retreating from its shores until only a muddy, then dry, basin remained. The fertile plain it sustained would have faltered. This was not a single blow like a tsunami, but a creeping stranglehold on their resources. The disappearance of that lake would have crippled the agricultural heartland supporting the palace, weakening Phaistos and contributing to the broader collapse of Minoan supremacy. The palace on the hill remained, but the world it was built to oversee had fundamentally and permanently changed. Jericho's walls are famous, but its water is what truly built the city. In the scorching Jordan Valley, the ancient settlement was known as the City of Palms, a title that speaks of lushness in a harsh land. This oasis was fed by the powerful Ain-es Sultan Spring, a gushing fountain that still flows today. Yet, some archaeologists examining the earliest layers of the site propose a more dramatic beginning. They suggest that before the famous spring was fully tapped, the founders of Jericho may have relied on something even grander, a seasonal lake or a vast, marshy oasis that formed in the valley lowlands. This body of water would have been a magnet for game and a natural reservoir, making the location not just habitable but exceptionally fertile for the first farmers. The question then becomes, what happened to that primeval lake? The answer may lie with Jericho's formidable neighbor, the Dead Sea. Geological studies show the Dead Sea's level has fluctuated wildly over millennia, rising and falling by hundreds of feet. A period of higher water in the Dead Sea would have pushed freshwater springs farther inland, potentially creating that expansive wetland around Jericho. But when the Dead Sea retreated, as it did in a major drought period around 8,000 years ago, the hydrological support would have collapsed. The great marsh would have drained away, its waters sinking into the parched earth or evaporating under the relentless sun. Compounding this, the Jordan Valley is part of the Great Rift Valley, one of the most seismically active zones on Earth. A powerful earthquake could have instantly rerouted underground aquifers, cutting off the water supply that fed the surface lake. The inhabitants of early Jericho would have faced a crisis. Their expansive, life-giving wetland was shrinking before their eyes, drying into cracked mudflats. This environmental pressure may have been the very catalyst for one of humanity's first great urban innovations. To survive, they had to master the one reliable source left, the Ain-es Sultan Spring. This is where engineering and legend intersect. The Bible, in the Book of Kings, tells a story of the prophets purifying Jericho's water by throwing salt into its spring. While miraculous, this tale hints at a very real, ancient problem: water salinity and contamination, possibly from a disrupted water table. More concretely, archaeologists have found evidence of sophisticated early water management at Jericho, including channels and pools designed to control and distribute every precious drop from the spring. The community transformed from one living alongside a generous lake to one fiercely defending and manipulating a single point of water. The disappearance of that larger water source didn't doom Jericho, it defined it. The need to protect and fairly allocate the spring's output may have been the original reason for people to gather closely and organize, providing the social glue that eventually led to those famous walls. The city's legendary resilience, its ability to rise again and again from ruins, is rooted in that ancient adaptation, a lesson learned when their first lake vanished and they learned to build a civilization on a well. High in the remote Altai Mountains, where Russia, Mongolia, and China meet, the silence of the steppe holds an echo of thunderous water. Today, the landscape is a patchwork of arid valleys and scattered salt flats, but the ground tells a different story. Immense, empty basins are carved into the earth, some stretching for dozens of miles, their floors strangely flat and littered with wave-rounded stones. These are not the work of slow erosion, they are the bathtubs of vanished giants. Geologists have mapped the ghostly shorelines of colossal lakes that once filled these valleys, trapped not by rock or sand but by walls of ice. During the last great ice age, advancing glaciers acted as natural dams, blocking river valleys and creating vast, deep reservoirs of meltwater. These were the lost glacial lakes of the Altai, and their endings were anything but quiet. The science points to a pattern of catastrophic release. An ice dam is a fragile, temporary plug. As pressures built from rising water or as the climate warmed, these frozen walls would fail spectacularly. The result was a glacial lake outburst flood, a deluge of almost unimaginable force. Within hours or days, an entire inland sea would empty itself, a wall of icy water and debris roaring down the mountain gorges with enough power to strip valleys down to bedrock and reshape the geography for hundreds of miles downstream. For the nomadic peoples who have called this region home for millennia, such an event would have been a world-ending cataclysm witnessed by their ancestors. The Scythians, fierce horseback warriors who dominated the steppes over 2,000 years ago, left behind their mark in the form of elaborate burial mounds called kurgans. Intriguingly, many of these ancient tombs are found overlooking the edges of these dry basins, as if placed on the former shores of the vanished lakes. Did they choose these sites because the flat, open lakebeds were sacred, or because they were memorials to a traumatic loss? The folklore of the Turkic and Mongolian peoples who succeeded them is saturated with water myths that feel less like metaphor and more like memory. Epic poems and oral tales speak of great floods that swept across the land, sent by angry water spirits or dragons. The legendary figure of a water dragon, or Lus, in Mongolian tradition is not merely a monster. It is a capricious deity of deep lakes and springs, capable of withholding water or unleashing devastating floods if displeased. Another widespread Altaic myth tells of a hero who must slay a monstrous creature that is swallowing all the water in the world, causing a great drought. Could this be a symbolic retelling of an ice dam's failure, the monstrous plug holding back the vital water until it is finally released in a catastrophic flood? The sequence is hauntingly consistent. A lake disappears either slowly through drought or suddenly through a flood, and the culture encodes the trauma in story. The sudden, terrifying disappearance of a glacial lake provides a perfect real-world anchor for these legends. One day, a vast, shimmering body of water fills the valley, a source of life and a landmark. Then, with a roar felt through the earth, it is gone, leaving behind a scar of mud and stone and a stunned population struggling to explain the impossible. That moment of catastrophic loss, echoing down generations, would inevitably transform into tales of dragons, heroes, and world-reshaping floods. The dry basins of the Altai are therefore more than geological curiosities. They are the physical evidence for a folklore written in water and fear, a direct link between the Earth's violent mechanics and the stories humans tell to make sense of a terrifying and unpredictable world. East of the thundering glacial floods, a different kind of vanishing act unfolded in silence and dust. The Taklamakan Desert in China's Xinjiang region is a sea of shifting sand dunes, one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. Yet for over 1,000 years, the lifeblood of the Silk Road flowed through its deadly embrace. That lifeblood was water, and its most famous source was a lake so elusive it earned the name Lop Ne, the Wandering Lake. Ancient Chinese records from the Han Dynasty, over 2,000 years ago, speak with reverence and caution of a great salt lake in the region, a vital landmark for caravans carrying silk, spices, and ideas between empires. But these early geographers also noted something deeply unsettling. The lake never seemed to stay in the same place. One decade's maps would show a vast, shimmering expanse. The next would find it shrunk or displaced, as if the land itself were refusing to be pinned down. The mystery of Lop Ne is not one of a single disappearance, but of a perpetual cycle of death and rebirth dictated by a single, capricious river. The lake had no permanent outlet. It was the terminal sink for the mighty Tarim River, which carried meltwater from the distant Tian Shan Mountains. Where the Tarim chose to end its journey, Lop Ne would bloom, but the Tarim flowed across a flat, featureless plain of loose silt. With no deep channel to contain it, the river would routinely silt up its own course, become blocked, and then fracture into new channels, abandoning its old delta and lake for a new one sometimes dozens of miles away. To a caravan relying on that water, this was a potentially fatal game of geographical hide and seek. A bustling oasis city one year could find its river drying up, its lake evaporating into a crust of salt, and its reason for existing gone within a generation. This is the precise fate that befell the legendary city of Lulan. Once a thriving hub on the Silk Road's northern route, Lulan was a place of wooden temples, multi-storied buildings, and a sophisticated society that acted as a crucial way station. Then the Tarim River shifted. The canals that fed Lulan's fields ran dry. The protective lake that may have moderated the desert winds shrank away, leaving the city exposed. Without water, the social contract dissolved. The people of Lulan were forced to abandon their homes to the encroaching dunes, leaving a perfectly preserved time capsule of daily life that would be swallowed by the sand for centuries. The disappearance of the lake did not just strand a city, it birthed a mythology of terror that traveled the Silk Road itself. Later travelers, like the Venetian merchant Marco Polo in the 13th century, would pass through the region's fringes and hear tales not of glorious cities but of haunted wastes. In his famous travelogue, he described the Taklamakan as a place filled with evil spirits that would lure travelers off the path with phantom voices and the sounds of ghostly caravans, only to leave them to die of thirst. These stories of demons and mirages were not mere superstition. They were a direct psychological consequence of the wandering lake. A mirage is a trick of light and air, but in a landscape where a life-saving body of water could literally move overnight, the line between illusion and reality blurred fatally. A traveler might see the shimmer of a remembered lake or follow old maps to a shoreline that was now a salt pan, and perish believing they were deceived by a malignant force. The demons of the Taklamakan were the personification of hydrological betrayal. Lop Ner's final, modern disappearance came not from a wandering river but from human hands. In the mid-20th century, massive agricultural projects upstream diverted nearly the entire flow of the Tarim River for irrigation. With its source severed, the great wandering lake had nowhere to go and nothing to feed it. It dried up completely, leaving behind a vast white salt flat visible from space. The ancient cycle was broken not by nature's whim but by our own. The tale of Lop Ner is a story of a landscape that refused to be tamed, where the most reliable feature was change itself, and where the loss of water could transform a center of civilization into a cautionary ghost story whispered across continents. Deep in the desert sands, the Egyptians built their cosmology not on stone but on water. The city of Heliopolis, the center of the sun god Ra's worship, was considered the first mound of creation to rise from the primordial waters of chaos. At its heart, texts speak of a sacred ceremonial lake known as the Sea of the Two Knives. This was no ordinary reservoir. Its name evokes a place of division and purification, a mythical body of water where rituals of kingship and cosmic order were performed. Priests would enact the nightly journey of the sun god, who was believed to traverse this celestial sea in his bark before being reborn at dawn. The lake was a physical mirror of the heavens, a crucial stage where the divine drama of death and rebirth was made tangible. Yet today, no such lake exists at the site. So where did this sacred sea go? The answer may lie in the ever-shifting pulse of the Nile itself. Geological corings of the Nile Delta reveal a landscape in constant motion, a braided maze of ancient river channels and abandoned floodplain depressions. One leading theory suggests that during a period of unusually high floods, the Nile could have catastrophically broken through its banks near Heliopolis, carving a new primary channel miles away from the city. Such a diversion would have been a hydrological catastrophe, severing the branch of the river that fed and replenished the ceremonial lake. Cut off from its source, the Sea of the Two Knives would have slowly evaporated under the Egyptian sun, shrinking from a shimmering ritual expanse to a brackish pond, and finally to a patch of cracked, dry earth. Another possibility points to a prolonged drought, a multi-decade failure of the annual inundation upon which all of Egypt depended. As the Nile's waters dwindled, the sacred lake, a symbol of abundance and cosmic stability, would have been the first to suffer, its decline a terrifying oasis of the god's displeasure. The religious impact of this physical loss would have been profound. We can see echoes of this trauma in the pyramid texts, the oldest known religious writings in the world. These spells, inscribed to guide the pharaoh's soul to the afterlife, are filled with anxious references to thirsty gods and the fear of celestial waters running dry. One spell pleads, "The sky is cloudless for me, the Nile is full for me," a mantra against drought. Another describes the deceased king needing to cross a great, threatening body of water, a possible reinterpretation of the now dry lake as a treacherous desert of the underworld. The disappearance of the Sea of the Two Knives likely forced a major theological shift. When the physical anchor for their most important ritual vanished, the priests of Heliopolis had to spiritualize the concept. The lake moved from being a place on earth to a purely celestial realm, its waters existing only in myth and ritual language. The solid ground of faith had to adapt when its liquid foundation seeped away, transforming a geographical feature into an enduring article of belief. The high plains of the Andes hold a sky so vast it feels like a different world. Here, Lake Titicaca endures, a deep blue mirror cradled between snow-capped peaks. Yet for the ancient Tiwanaku civilization that flourished on its shores over 1,000 years ago, this great lake was just one part of a much wetter landscape. Their legends, passed down through generations, speak of other sacred waters, a lake of the moon that mirrored Titicaca's sun, and expansive lagoons that have since vanished from the high Altiplano. These stories are not mere fantasy, they are geological memory. Scientists studying this stark plateau have found unmistakable evidence, ancient shorelines etched into the mountainsides like bathtub rings, some perched hundreds of feet above the current water level of Titicaca. These silent lines prove that a vast, interconnected super lake once covered much of the region, a colossal inland sea whose retreat defined human history here. The most telling modern example is Lake Pupo, Titicaca's downstream neighbor. Satellite images over recent decades show a heartbreaking cycle. Pupo fills to a sprawling, shallow sea, supporting fishing villages and flocks of flamingos, only to vanish almost completely into a blinding white salt flat during severe droughts, leaving boats stranded on dry land. This is not a new phenomenon. Sediment cores from its bed reveal this cycle of death and rebirth has repeated for millennia. For the Tiwanaku, whose entire society was built on sophisticated raised field agriculture that required precise water management, the disappearance of these satellite lakes would have been a crisis written in the drying earth. A prolonged drought, perhaps lasting decades and linked to larger climate cycles like the El Niño Southern Oscillation, would have seen the waters recede, the fish die, and the fertile wetlands that buffered their crops turn to dust. How does a culture explain such a betrayal by the heavens? Their answer is written in their enduring mythology. The Incas, who came later, inherited and formalized the Andean worldview of living, conscious landscapes. They believed that towering peaks, or apus, were powerful mountain gods who controlled the weather and the flow of water from their glacial crowns. An angry apu would withhold the rains, causing springs to fail and lakes to evaporate. The rituals that developed, from small village offerings of coca leaves and chicha beer to the capacocha, the rare and solemn sacrifice of a child on a summit, were ultimately negotiations with these divine landlords. The goal was to appease the mountain's wrath and restore the balance of water. The disappearance of a lake was not a random weather event. It was a direct consequence of broken reciprocity between humans and the sacred geography. When the Lake of the Moon vanished, it was because the Apu had turned its face away. This belief system provided a framework for understanding catastrophe and a prescribed, if desperate, path to potentially reverse it. The ruins of Tiwanaku, with their monolithic gateways aligned to celestial events, stand not just as an engineering marvel, but as a monument to a civilization that spent centuries trying to read the sky and placate the mountains, all in an endless struggle to keep the water from abandoning their world. The mountains of the Andes stand in silent contrast to a world now entirely lost beneath the waves. Between the British Isles and mainland Europe today lies only the cold, grey swell of the North Sea. But for thousands of years after the last ice age, this was not a sea at all. It was Doggerland, a vast, low-lying plain of hills, marshes and forests, a continent in miniature that connected Britain to the rest of Europe. This was a rich landscape teeming with deer, aurochs and other game, and it was dotted with something crucial for the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who roamed their freshwater lakes. These bodies of water were centers of life, places for fishing, hunting migrating birds and gathering resources. Then the world warmed. As the great ice sheets melted, global sea levels began a relentless, inexorable rise. For the people of Doggerland, this was not a sudden event but a creeping, generational transformation. The rising ocean first began to isolate their interior lakes. Salt water would breach river valleys, cutting off the freshwater sources that fed these inland pools. A lake that once sustained a community would slowly turn brackish, its fish dying off, its edges becoming undrinkable. Then the sea would claim it entirely, swallowing the freshwater haven and replacing it with the tides of a growing estuary. Finally, the sea would come for the land itself. Families might return to a familiar hunting ground only to find the forest path now underwater, or watch a storm surge flood a valley that had been home for generations. This was a slow-motion disappearance witnessed by hundreds of human lifetimes, a world dissolving foot by foot, year by year. The physical evidence of this lost world is now pulled from the seabed by trawlers and archaeologists. Fishermen in the North Sea have for decades brought up unexpected treasures in their nets, not just shells and stones, but ancient tree stumps, the bones of mammoths and lions, and most tellingly, blocks of compacted freshwater peat. This peat is the preserved soil of Doggerland's vanished marshes and lake edges, a tangible piece of a landscape that hasn't seen the sun for over 8,000 years. These finds map a ghost geography, proving that the stories of this land are not fantasy but drowned history. Could the memory of this great drowning have survived? While the Mesolithic inhabitants left no written records, their descendants certainly told stories. Scholars have long noted the profound similarity between flood myths across disparate European cultures, from the Celtic legends of a sunken kingdom like Lyoness off Cornwall, to the Welsh story of Cantref Gwaelod, a fertile lowland lost to the sea when a well was left uncovered. The most famous, of course, is the biblical story of Noah, but versions of a world-reshaping deluge appear in ancient Greek, Norse, and Mesopotamian traditions. The universal thread is a great flood sent by the gods, punishing humanity and wiping the slate of the world clean. While these stories were recorded millennia after Doggerland sank, they may hold a kernel of ancestral trauma. A catastrophic event like the Storegga Slide, a massive underwater landslide off Norway around 6,150 years ago that triggered a devastating tsunami across the North Sea, could have provided the final dramatic chapter. For communities already retreating from rising waters, a towering wall of water sweeping across the remaining plains would have been an apocalyptic finale, an event so terrifying it would be woven into the foundational myths of countless cultures. The disappearance of Doggerland's lakes and then its very earth was perhaps the first great environmental cataclysm to shape the European imagination, a loss so vast it could only be explained as the wrath of the gods, a story told and retold to explain why the world beyond the shore was forever gone. The memory of a drowned world haunts the shores of the Baltic Sea in a very specific form. Here, the lost landscape of Doggerland finds its echo in a single, glittering name, Vinter. In Slavic and Germanic folklore, Vinter was not just a city, it was a legend of unparalleled wealth and pride, a bustling hub of merchants from all over the known world, where gold was said to be as common as sand. Its towers gleamed, its markets overflowed with silks and spices, and its people grew arrogant in their prosperity. The stories all end the same way, as a divine punishment for their sinfulness, particularly their greed and vanity. the entire city was swallowed by the sea in a single stormy night. The waves closed over its spires forever, leaving only the mournful sound of church bells heard by fishermen on quiet days. For centuries, this was dismissed as pure moral fable. Yet, geology now whispers that the legend may be anchored in a profound geographical truth. Along the Pomeranian coast of modern-day Poland and Germany, scientists drilling into the seabed have uncovered thick layers of freshwater peat buried beneath marine sediments. This is the preserved, compacted remains of an ancient freshwater ecosystem, the unmistakable signature of a lagoon or a shallow lake system that once existed where there is now only salt water. This land was not a city of stone, but a low-lying, fertile wetland, rich in resources and likely inhabited. Then, around 6,000 years ago, the same post-glacial sea level rise that drowned Doggerland began to encroach here. The Baltic Sea advanced, its waters breaching sandbars and barrier islands in a series of catastrophic storm surges. These events would have violently flooded the coastal lagoon, transforming it from a sheltered freshwater haven into a brackish, then fully marine extension of the sea. For the people living there, it would have felt exactly like the world ending, their home and its vital lake vanishing beneath an angry ocean. The legend of Winter is a brilliant cultural fusion of these two traumas, the loss of a landscape and the loss of a community. The sunken city is the human face of the catastrophe, a way to give meaning to the incomprehensible loss of home. The moral framework, the punishment for sin, provides a cause for the inexplicable disaster. It was not random nature, but a consequence of human failing, a story that offered both an explanation and a warning to future generations. The legendary wealth of Winter might even be a folk memory of the area's actual abundance, the rich fishing, hunting, and trading opportunities provided by the fertile lagoon before it was taken. So, while archaeologists may never find golden towers under the Baltic waves, they have found something perhaps more meaningful, the physical proof of the lost world that inspired the myth. Winter stands as a powerful example of how a lake's disappearance can evolve in human memory, transforming from an environmental event into a foundational story about morality, loss, and the perilous line between land and sea. The rustle of leaves replaced the whisper of water at one of Greece's most sacred sites. High in the remote mountains of Epirus, the Oracle of Dodona predated even the famous oracle at Delphi. This was the oldest Hellenic sanctuary, dedicated to Zeus himself, where priests and priestesses interpreted the god's will. Ancient visitors described a valley cradling a sacred spring or a small, mysterious lake, its waters possessing a strange, murmuring quality thought to carry divine messages. The sound of the water itself was the first oracle. Centuries later, however, travelers noted the site was dry. That prophetic spring or lake had vanished. The culprit here was likely the same karstic limestone geology that challenged the engineers at Lake Kopais. The valley at Dodona sits on a porous bedrock riddled with fissures and underground rivers. A sudden geological event, such as a minor earthquake or the natural collapse of a subterranean cavity, could have acted like a drain being pulled. The sacred waters would have disappeared almost overnight, swallowed into the dark labyrinth below. For the priests and supplicants, this was not a mere inconvenience, it was a theological crisis. The very medium of their prophecy had been taken from them by the earth. The response was a remarkable adaptation of faith. Deprived of the talking water, the guardians of the sanctuary shifted their focus to a new natural interpreter, the rustling leaves of the great sacred oak tree of Zeus. The wind moving through the branches became the new voice of the god, interpreted by the priestesses known as the Peleiades or doves. The oracle survived, but its fundamental character changed. The solid, rooted tree replaced the fluid, elusive water as the primary conduit to the divine. This shift may even be embedded in the site's own mythology. One founding legend said the oracle was established when a black dove, sent from Egyptian Thebes, landed in the oak tree and spoke with a human voice. It is a compelling thought that this story gained prominence or was reinvented after the water disappeared, providing a divine justification for the new arboreal focus. The disappearance of the lake at Dodona shows us how a single geological accident could force a complete reimagining of sacred practice, turning a listening ear from the murmur of a spring to the sigh of the wind in the leaves, a testament to humanity's relentless drive to find meaning in nature, even when its signals suddenly change. A different kind of oracle lay sleeping in the hills of Germany. The Eifel region, with its gentle green landscape, hides a violent volcanic past beneath its surface. Scattered across this terrain are peculiar circular depressions, some filled with serene blue water, others holding only meadows or forests. These are Mars' shallow craters blasted out by steam explosions when magma met groundwater thousands of years ago. To the Romans who marched through this land, these crater lakes were notable landmarks, recorded as permanent features on their maps and in their military logs. Yet later surveys, even by medieval times, noted that some of these lakes were gone. The serene waters recorded by Roman centurions had simply vanished, leaving behind empty bowls of earth. The science behind these disappearances is as fascinating as it is direct. A Mar lake is a delicate balance. It exists because the water table is high enough to fill the crater like a bowl in a saturated sponge. If that water table drops due to prolonged drought, or if geological shifts divert underground aquifers, the bowl empties. The lake drains back into the very earth that created it, sometimes over years, sometimes seemingly overnight. More dramatically, volcanic activity in the deep magma chambers below can change the mix of gases seeping up through the bedrock. An increase in certain gases can make the water acidic or toxic, killing all life within it and accelerating evaporation, leaving a sterile basin behind. Take the Pulver Mar, one of the deepest of these lakes today. Its neighbor, the nearby Hulls Mar, shows evidence in its sediment layers of having dried out completely in the past. For the Celtic tribes who inhabited this land long before the Romans, these were not geological features, they were sacred thresholds. The deep, circular, and often eerily still waters of the Mars were seen as portals to the otherworld, gateways to the realm of gods, spirits, and ancestors. A lake that suddenly disappeared would have been a moment of profound spiritual crisis. It wasn't a drought, it was a door slamming shut. The closing of a portal would mean the severing of a vital connection to divine forces, a loss of access to wisdom, healing, or the favor of the gods. This Celtic interpretation likely seeped into the bedrock of local folklore, shaping the stories told by the Germanic peoples who came later. The region is rich with tales of entrances to the underworld that appear and vanish, of spirits associated with specific, often transient, pools and lakes. The sudden disappearance of a crater lake provided a powerful, real-world anchor for these myths, explaining why a sacred site might be potent one generation and barren the next. It taught that the boundary between worlds was not fixed but fluid and could be withdrawn by forces beyond human understanding. The Mississippi River once supported a city that rivaled the great urban centers of its time. Across the river from modern St. Louis, the sprawling metropolis of Cahokia rose from the floodplain, a capital of the Mississippian culture known as the Mound Builders. At its peak around the year 1100, it was home to tens of thousands of people, its skyline dominated by enormous earthen pyramids, the greatest of which, Monk's Mound, still stands 10 stories tall. This was not a city of stone, but of earth, wood, and most crucially, water. The landscape was a patchwork of oxbow lakes, ponds, and backwater sloughs left behind by the meandering Mississippi. These water bodies were the lifeblood of Cahokia, providing fish, waterfowl, and clay for pottery, and serving as transportation corridors for the dugout canoes that connected the city to a vast trade network. Core samples taken from the soil beneath the modern farmland tell a troubling story. Layers of sediment reveal that many of these vital lakes and ponds began to fill with silt at an alarming rate, and some appear to have drained away entirely, right around the 13th and 14th centuries, the very period of Cahokia's dramatic decline. The water was literally vanishing from under them. So what caused this hydrological collapse? The answer points directly to the city's own success. To build their monumental mounds and house their growing population, the Cahokians cleared vast tracts of forest. This deforestation had a cascading effect. Without tree roots to hold the soil in place, the soft loess of the floodplain became vulnerable. Spring rains and river floods would have washed unprecedented amounts of topsoil into the lakes, accelerating their natural tendency to silt up and become marshes. Furthermore, the city's immense need for wood for construction and fuel likely lowered the local water table, causing some of the shallower ponds to simply seep back into the earth or evaporate. The engineered landscape they created to support their grandeur may have inadvertently triggered its own unraveling. The memory of this ecological turning point may be preserved in the oral traditions of descendant Siwan peoples. Stories passed down speak of a time when the land grew tired, when the game became scarce, and significantly, when the waters retreated. This phrase, "the waters retreated," is not a vague metaphor, it is a precise environmental memory. It echoes the scientific data of filled-in lake beds and lowered water tables. For a society whose identity, economy, and daily survival were intertwined with the aquatic landscape, the retreat of the waters would have been more than an inconvenience, it was a fundamental breakdown of their world. The silting of the lakes would have crippled the local fisheries. The loss of ponds and wetlands would have disrupted migratory bird patterns, a key food source. As the hydrological web frayed, the social and political fabric of Cahokia likely did too. People began to leave, dispersing back into smaller, more sustainable communities along the river tributaries. The great city was not conquered or sacked, it was slowly abandoned as its relationship with the water soured. The story of Cahokia's lost lakes is a powerful reminder that even the most impressive civilizations are built upon ecological partnerships, and when those partnerships fail, the foundations can turn to dust or, in this case, to dry, silent earth. The great desert of the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, was not always empty. Its sands whisper a secret of lost waters, a memory kept alive in the verses of ancient Arab poets. For centuries before Islam, nomadic bards composed odes to a greener land, describing places where gazelles gathered to drink from clear lakes, and where cities of legend like Yuba, the Atlantis of the sands, stood as wealthy hubs along the frankincense trails. These were not pure fantasies. The Greek geographer Ptolemy, working from the reports of traders, actually mapped these features in the 2nd century, charting lakes and settlements in a region his sources knew could sustain life. For a long time, these accounts were dismissed as the exaggerations of travelers or the metaphors of poets. Then the eye in the sky saw what the sand had hidden. Modern satellite radar, piercing the top layers of dunes, revealed the ghostly imprint of a lost world. The images show vast, dry riverbeds called wadis snaking across the desert floor, and the unmistakable, pale outlines of ancient lakebeds, some as large as small seas buried beneath the earth. This was a network of oasis lakes, a hydrological web that once made the impossible crossing of the Rub al-Khali not just possible but profitable. The most vital trade of the ancient world, the transport of frankincense from the trees of southern Arabia to the courts of Egypt, Rome, and Persia, depended utterly on these way stations. A caravan loaded with priceless resin could only travel so far without water. These lakes were the stepping stones of civilization, the reason a city like Yuba could exist in the heart of nowhere. So what happened to the Lake of the Gazelles? The answer is written in the slow, grand movements of Earth's climate. Around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, the monsoon belt that brings seasonal rains to the region began a gradual but decisive shift southward. The life-giving rains that had sustained the interior lakes and recharged the wadis simply stopped arriving. Deprived of their source, the lakes began a long, thirsty death. They didn't drain in a catastrophic flood, they evaporated. Each year, the sun drank a little more, the shores receded a little farther, and the fresh water grew saltier until what was left was a bitter, shrinking puddle, and then, finally, a dry, salt-crusted depression. The desertification was a slow stranglehold. As the lakes vanished, the ecological support system collapsed. The gazelles left, the vegetation that held the dunes at bay died off, and the sand, no longer anchored, began its relentless march. For the frankincense traders, the consequences were dire and direct. A crucial watering hole on your map one decade could be a dune field the next. The cost and risk of crossing the empty quarter skyrocketed. Caravans had to take longer, more perilous routes around the desert's edges, adding time and expense. The cities that existed solely to service this trade, like fabled Yuba, found their reason for being literally buried in sand. Their wells ran dry, their population scattered, and their memory faded into poetry and myth. The disappearance of the Arabian oasis lakes was more than an environmental change, it was an economic and cultural cataclysm. It rerouted the flow of ancient wealth, dismantled urban centers, and transformed one of the world's most important trade commodities into a far rarer, more expensive luxury. The empty quarter earned its name not through a sudden disaster, but through a millennia-long sigh, the last breath of a green world leaving behind only poetry, radar ghosts, and dunes that still hide the shores of vanished seas. The disappearance of a desert lake leaves a void filled by sand, but in the lush jungles of the Yucatan, a vanishing act reveals a hidden world beneath your feet. This limestone peninsula has no rivers on its surface, for the entire landscape is a giant, porous sponge. Rainwater does not flow across the ground, it percolates down, carving a labyrinth of flooded caves and underground rivers in the soft bedrock. The only windows to this secret world are the cenotes, breathtaking sinkholes where the ceiling of a cave has collapsed, exposing the dark, fresh water below. For the ancient Maya, these were not just water sources, they were sacred openings. Their codices and the archaeological record show they also relied on surface lakes, known as aguadas, which formed in natural depressions where clay sealed the porous rock. These lakes were vital for drinking water, agriculture, and community ceremonies. Yet, in a land built on hollow ground, permanence is an illusion. Geological evidence from several Maya sites points to a terrifying phenomenon. A surface lake could simply disappear overnight. The thin limestone roof of an underlying cavern, weakened by water erosion or seismic tremor, would catastrophically collapse. The entire lake, along with anything on its shores, would be swallowed in a roaring vortex, draining into the aquifer below. One moment, a life-giving resource, the next, a gaping pit leading into darkness. For the Maya, who saw the cosmos as a delicate balance between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld, such an event was profoundly symbolic. It was not a random geological accident, it was a direct message. The rain god Chok was a central, capricious deity depicted with a curling serpentine nose from which life-giving water flowed. A lake draining into the depths would have been interpreted as Chok reclaiming his water, a sign of terrible displeasure or a shift in the divine order. More ominously, the newly opened sinkhole was a portal. The Maya underworld, Xibalba, meaning place of fright, was not a metaphorical concept, it was a real, watery subterranean realm of disease, death, and treacherous gods. A cenote was literally an entrance to this feared domain. The sudden creation of one by a lake's disappearance would have been seen as the veil between worlds tearing open. This belief directly shaped Maya ritual in startling ways. Archaeological dives into sacred cenotes, like the famous cenote Sagrado at Chichen Itza, have recovered not just precious jade and gold but human remains. These were offerings to the gods of Xibalba, cast into the watery portal to appease them or to send messengers. Imagine the psychological impact of a lake vanishing. The community would immediately see the new cenote as a dangerous, powerful opening that demanded propitiation. Rituals would intensify at that very spot, transforming a place of loss into a focal point of worship and fear. The practice of constructing ceremonial architecture around cenotes, or even creating artificial ones within temple complexes, can be seen as an attempt to control and sanctify these unpredictable gateways. By building a temple over a sinkhole, they were architecturally managing the terrifying interface between their world and the next. The sinking lakes of the Yucatan taught the Maya that the ground itself was alive and communicative, a thin crust over a divine, liquid underworld that could reclaim its gifts at any moment. Their entire relationship with water was shaped by this vertigo, knowing that the pool they drank from today might tomorrow become a doorway to the land of the dead. A shimmering lake in the Highlands could be gone by next season. Across Scotland, place names like Loch Nan Yun, the Loch of the Birds, mark spots on the map where water once lay, but where today you will find only a soft green meadow or a spongy peat bog. These are the ghost lakes, bodies of water that did not drain or flood away but were slowly, silently consumed by the land itself. The process is called paludification, and it is a quiet conquest. Over centuries, mosses, especially sphagnum moss, begin to form a floating mat at the lake's edge. This living carpet thickens and creeps inward year by year, drawing minerals from the water and making it more acidic. As the moss dies, it sinks, accumulating in the cold, oxygen-poor water and not fully decomposing. Layer upon layer of this semi-rotted plant matter builds up, filling the lake from the bottom and the sides until the open water is choked out entirely. What remains is a peat bog, a deceptive green blanket that can hide deep, cold water beneath its surface. For an observer across generations, the lake doesn't vanish, it transforms, shrinking from a wide expanse to a mere pond, then to a reedy marsh, and finally to a solid-seeming field. This slow-motion disappearance, witnessed but not understood, became fertile ground for some of the Celtic world's most enduring and cautionary tales. The sudden absence of a familiar landmark demanded a story. Folklore filled the void with enchantment and danger. A lake that was there one year and gone the next was not a natural process. It was clearly the work of the Sith, the fairy folk. These lakes were said to be fairy glamours, illusions cast over their hidden palaces that would occasionally fade, revealing the true, waterless landscape beneath. More ominously, the treacherous nature of the new ground inspired stories of the kelpie, the shape-shifting waterhorse. This creature was said to haunt lonely lochs, appearing as a beautiful tame horse on the shore. But any traveler who mounted it would find themselves glued to its back as it leaped into the deep water, drowning them. The kelpie legend is a perfect ecological warning codified in myth. The newly formed bog, with its inviting green moss over hidden water pockets, is exactly the kind of terrain that could swallow a person or an animal whole. A step onto that soft, green meadow could mean plunging into a cold, watery grave. The story of the kelpie taught children and travelers to respect these liminal spaces, to see the beautiful, empty meadow not as a safe path, but as a potential trap left by a malevolent spirit. Sites like the now-vanished Loch of the Birds or the many lochen that dot the maps only as memories are physical records of this slow geological change. Their disappearance was so gradual it felt magical, a transition between worlds that could only be explained by the capricious will of the unseen beings who ruled the wild places. The ghost lakes remind us that sometimes the most profound changes are not sudden cataclysms, but slow absorptions where the land patiently drinks its own waters and leaves behind a story to explain the silence. The silence of a Scottish bog is a slow theft, but in Iceland the land does not steal, it screams. The Norse sagas, those gripping chronicles of settlement and survival, are filled with more than just feuds and heroes. They are also meticulous, if terrified, geological records. The Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, describes in stark prose the moment when a known landscape was ripped away. Settlers would speak of a substantial lake nestled against a glacier, a reliable source of water and perhaps fish. Then, without warning, the ground would tremble. From the ice came a roar that shook the sky, and by morning the lake was gone. In its place lay a vast, scarred plain of jumbled rock, gravel, and sand, a wasteland where water had flowed just hours before. The settlers had witnessed one of nature's most violent hydrological events, a Jökulhlaup. This Icelandic word means glacial run, but it describes an apocalyptic flood. These lakes are born trapped, dammed not by earth, but by the glacier's own ice or by ridges of volcanic debris. The water builds in secret under immense pressure until the dam fails. The release is catastrophic. A wall of meltwater, ice blocks, and shattered rock explodes from the glacier's snout, scouring the land down to bedrock and emptying the lake in a single, furious event. To the Norse, who had no concept of subglacial volcanism or hydraulic pressure, the explanation was not geological but mythological. This was not a natural process, it was the work of Jotun, the giants, or the treacherous trolls who were said to inhabit the mountains and ice. A lake vanishing overnight was a direct assault by these ancient, chaotic forces against the order the settlers were trying to impose. The barren plain left behind, called a sandur, was not just an inconvenience, it was a battlefield, a testament to a power that could erase a part of the world between dusk and dawn. This interpretation wove the event into their cultural fabric. Later sagas might recount how a particular valley was cursed or uninhabitable because the land spirits there were too angry, a folk memory of a place regularly ravaged by outburst floods. The story transformed a terrifying act of random geology into a narrative of conflict, a lesson about the peril of settling in a land where the very earth was alive with hostile, invisible beings. The vanished lake became a character in their epic, a casualty in the eternal struggle between humans and the ancient giants of the ice. Australia's heart holds a contradiction. Lake Eyre today is a blinding white salt pan, a flat expanse of cracked earth that shimmers with heat haze. For years, even decades, it is a desert within a desert. Then, every so often, a miracle happens. Rains flood the distant northern rivers, and the water finds its way south in a slow, creeping pulse across the plains, transforming the pan into a vast, shallow sea that teems with birds and life. This cycle feels like a rare exception, a fleeting gift in a dry land. Yet, for the Aboriginal peoples whose connection to this country spans tens of thousands of years, this is not the full story. Their Dreamtime narratives, the foundational stories of creation and law, speak of something profoundly different. They tell of permanent inland seas, of mighty rivers that flowed where now there are only dry creek beds, and of waterholes that were once deep and reliable. These are not metaphors, they are precise, geographical memories preserved in songlines, the intricate oral maps that chart the landscape through story and ceremony. One such story from the Arrernte people describes the formation of the MacDonnell Ranges by ancestral caterpillars, a narrative that also details ancient watercourses that have no modern equivalent. Another, from the Lake Eyre Basin itself, speaks of a time when the lake was always full, a permanent body around which giant animals gathered. For generations of European settlers, these accounts were seen as symbolic myths. Modern paleoclimatology, the study of past climates, has proven them to be historical records. Scientists drilling cores into the salt crust of Lake Eyre and other dry basins have pulled up layers of sediment that tell a startling tale. Pollen grains from deep within the cores reveal evidence of rainforests and lush vegetation. More strikingly, they contain the fossils of megafauna, the gigantic animals of a lost world like the Diprotodon, a wombat the size of a rhinoceros, and giant kangaroos. These creatures were not desert dwellers. They required vast amounts of fresh water and abundant plant life to survive. Their bones are not scattered randomly. They are often found concentrated around the fossilized shorelines of ancient permanent lakes. The land itself confirms what the stories have always said. This was a green, well-watered continent. So what happened to those inland seas? The process was a slow, relentless aridification that unfolded over thousands of years. As the last ice age waned, global climate patterns shifted. Australia, already a flat and weathered continent, grew hotter and drier. The monsoon rains that once soaked the interior retreated northward. The great inland lakes, deprived of their lifeblood, began a long, agonizing death. They evaporated under the strengthening sun, leaving behind concentrated salts and minerals, their beds turning first to mud, then to the hard, white pans we see today. The megafauna, trapped in a shrinking paradise, died out. This was a catastrophe in slow motion, witnessed by hundreds of human generations. The genius of Aboriginal culture was in its response to this crisis. As the waters vanished, they did not forget them. Instead, they encoded the knowledge of the old, wetter world into their living tradition. A songline that describes a journey from one waterhole to another might be following the course of a river that has not flowed for 15,000 years. The story of a giant serpent carving a path through the land can be a precise description of an ancient river channel now visible only from the air. The ceremonies performed at a particular rock or dry claypan often commemorate and invoke the spirit of the water that was once there. This oral history became a survival manual and a sacred duty, a way of keeping the map of a lost hydrological landscape alive in memory, ensuring that if the waters ever returned, even in dream, the people would remember their true shape. The ephemeral flood of Lake Eyre is therefore a fleeting glimpse of a world the ancestors knew intimately. When the water spreads across the pan, it is not just filling a basin, it is briefly resurrecting a geography held in trust for millennia by the oldest continuous culture on Earth. The lake's disappearance is not a permanent state, but one phase in a cycle so long that its memory exists not in books, but in the very songs of the land. The great city of Ur was not always surrounded by desert sands. For the Sumerians, it was a coastal capital. Cuneiform tablets from its zenith speak of bustling docks, of ships arriving from distant lands like Dilmun, and of a thriving economy built on the bounty of a sheltered lagoon or lake that connected the city directly to the Persian Gulf. This was not a minor feature, it was the city's lifeblood, a highway for trade and a source of fish that fed its people. You can almost hear the lap of water against the quays, the shouts of merchants unloading copper and lapis lazuli. Modern eyes, however, see a different picture. Today, the ruins of Ur sit in a stark, dry landscape miles from the sea. The water is gone. The secret to this transformation is written not just in clay tablets, but in the very dirt beneath our feet, visible from space. Satellite imagery and geological surveys reveal the ghostly outlines of ancient shorelines, like faint pencil lines on a map, tracing the edges of that vanished body of water. This was not a sudden catastrophe, but a disappearance measured in centuries, a slow-motion burial conducted by the rivers that gave the region life. The Tigris and Euphrates, carrying immense loads of silt from the mountains of Anatolia, deposited their sediment where the fresh water met the salt, right at the mouth of the lagoon. Year after year, flood after flood, the silt built up. It filled the channels, choked the inlets, and pushed the coastline steadily southward. The deep, navigable lagoon first became a shallow, marshy lake, then a labyrinth of reedy wetlands, and finally, as the water retreated completely, a flat plain of dry, salty earth. For the rulers and merchants of Ur, this was an economic crisis in ultra-slow motion. A port city cannot survive when its port disappears. As the waterways silted up, the great trading ships could no longer reach the city's docks. The cost of bringing goods in and out skyrocketed as cargo had to be unloaded onto smaller boats, then dragged through ever shallower channels. The lucrative fisheries would have dwindled as the water habitat changed. The city's wealth, its very reason for being a major power, was literally being strangled by mud. This environmental shift did not cause Ur's fall alone, but it critically weakened the city, making it more vulnerable to conquest, shifts in trade routes, and social unrest. Imagine the frustration of the last generation of merchants at Ur, watching their world-class harbor become a swamp. then a mudflat, knowing their children would inherit a city cut off from the sea that made it great. The disappearance of that lake was a quiet geological verdict on a civilization, a reminder that even the mightiest cities are guests in a landscape that is always slowly changing the rules. The island of Thera was a sleeping giant before the cataclysm that would reshape the Mediterranean. It was not the fragmented crescent we call Santorini today. It was a single, towering volcano, and geological models suggest that nestled within its central cone lay a deep, freshwater lake. This was not a small pond, but a significant body of water, a cool, placid mirror held in the palm of a mountain. It was a vital resource for the thriving Minoan settlement on its slopes, a community so advanced it adorned its walls with breathtaking frescoes. One famous mural, the spring fresco from the nearby island of Thera itself, shows a vibrant, rolling landscape dotted with red lilies and swooping swallows. While it depicts a hillside, not a lake, the sheer exuberance of its life speaks to a world of abundance, a world intimately familiar with the lushness that a reliable freshwater source could provide. That central lake would have been the anchor of that abundance, the unseen heart of the island's ecology. Then the heart exploded. Around the year 1600 before the Common Era, the volcano awoke with a violence almost beyond comprehension. The entire center of the island, including the mountain that cradled the lake, was blasted into the stratosphere. The eruption emptied the magma chamber below, causing the land to collapse in on itself. In a single geological instant, the freshwater lake was utterly annihilated, vaporized by heat or swallowed into the abyss. The sea rushed in to fill the colossal, steaming wound, creating the vast, deep saltwater caldera we see today. The destruction was so total that it erased the lake's very existence from the local landscape, leaving no direct memory, only a haunting absence. The shockwaves of this event, however, rippled far beyond the Aegean. While no Egyptian record mentions a specific lake on a distant island, they do document a profound and mysterious crisis. The reign of Pharaoh Ahmose I saw strange, unprecedented weather. The Tempest Stele, an inscription from his time, describes a storm of apocalyptic darkness, with thunder louder than the cries of the masses and a sky so choked with rain it blotted out the sun for days. This period of chaos and upheaval aligns perfectly with the climatic aftermath of the Thera eruption, which would have caused global cooling and freak weather patterns for years. For the Egyptians, it was as if the natural order had been inverted, a divine punishment or a cosmic battle. Could the memory of Thera's lost lake be hidden within the greatest of all vanished civilization legends? The philosopher Plato, writing over 1,000 years later, described Atlantis as a powerful island kingdom with a central, concentric city built around a holy mountain. He wrote of a great plain, fertile and well-watered, and of a catastrophic end where the island was swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. The parallels are striking: a central mountain, a fertile land, a sudden maritime cataclysm. While Plato's Atlantis is a complex philosophical allegory, many scholars believe its core was inspired by garbled Egyptian accounts of the real Thera disaster passed down through generations. The vanished freshwater lake at Thera's heart may be the forgotten seed of this myth, the placid center that was first obliterated by fire, then replaced forever by the invading sea. The legend of a lost paradise swallowed by the waves is in essence the story of that caldera's birth, a folk memory of the moment a mountain and its lake ceased to be, leaving only a ring of islands around a deep blue void. Caravans crossing the Kizilkum Desert navigated a sea of red sand with only two certainties: the distant rivers that framed it, the Amu Darya and the Sadaria. Medieval Arab scholars, meticulous in their cartography, charted another lifeline between them, a chain of lakes. The great polymath al-Biruni, writing in the 11th century, recorded these bodies of water as clear geographic facts, essential waypoints for merchants carrying silk and spices. Yet, centuries later, European explorers following his maps found only endless dunes and scorching salt flats. The lakes he documented were simply gone. This was not an error in observation, but a testament to a landscape in constant, treacherous flux. These lakes were terminal sinks, the final, thirsty destinations for smaller rivers and streams that drained from the distant Pamir Mountains. They existed in a delicate balance, entirely dependent on the flow that fed them. That balance was shattered by two powerful forces. First, the Earth itself was restless. The region is seismically active, and a significant earthquake could literally tilt the plain, diverting a river's course dozens of miles away, abandoning its lake to the desert sun. Second, and perhaps more decisively, was human ambition. The powerful Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled this region for centuries, was a civilization of hydrological engineers. They constructed vast networks of canals called ariks to irrigate their sprawling oasis cities and fertile fields. These canals siphoned water directly from the very rivers that sustained the desert lakes. Each new agricultural project upstream meant a little less water reached the terminal basin downstream. Over generations, the diversion became a death sentence. The lake would begin to shrink, its shores receding, its water growing saltier until it fractured into a few bitter ponds and then nothing at all. For the Silk Road traveler, this presented a peril that was both logistical and psychological. Your survival depended on reaching that next water source marked on your map or described by the last caravan. To arrive at the coordinates and find not a shimmering oasis, but a blinding white playa of cracked mud and salt was a death sentence. The wells you dug would yield only dust. Your animals would perish, and the desert would claim another group of victims. It is from this repeated, terrifying experience that some of the Silk Road's most enduring legends were born. Tales spread of glorious cities, rich from trade, that were punished for their arrogance by being swallowed whole by the sands. Often, these stories specified that the city was built beside a great lake. The city's sin caused the lake to vanish, and without its water, the sands marched in and buried everything. These legends of lost cities like those in the Kizilkum are not pure fantasy. They are a folk explanation for a real archaeological phenomenon. When the lake disappeared, the microclimate it supported collapsed, vegetation died, and the loose silt of the former lakebed, now dry, was picked up by the wind. This created catastrophic dust storms and provided the material for dunes that could indeed engulf settlements. A city abandoned when its water source failed would, within a few generations, be buried under the very sediment its own success had helped to create. The lost lakes of the Kizilkum teach us that on the Silk Road, the greatest threat was not always bandits or distance, but the betrayal of your own map, a reminder that the most reliable features in a desert are often the stories of what has already vanished. Even a fictional lake can have its roots in a forgotten landscape. In one of the oldest stories of the Western world, Homer's Odyssey, a moment of profound solace emerges from a vanished place. As Telemachus mourns his lost father, the Spartan queen Helen offers him a mysterious substance called nepenthes, a drug that banishes all grief and memory of pain. Homer specifies its origin, saying it came from Egypt, a gift from a woman of that land, and that it grew near a certain lake. This is not a detailed geographical marker, but a haunting whisper of a real pharmacopoeia lost to time. For ancient audiences, Egypt was a land of medical and magical prowess, so the detail lent credibility to the potion's power. But what if that offhand mention near a certain lake points to a truth buried in the poetry? Scholars of ancient botany and ethnobotany have long tried to identify nepenthes. While its description as a grief-erasing drug is mythic, it likely refers to a real psychoactive plant, perhaps a powerful opiate like the opium poppy, or a potent sedative like henbane or mandrake, plants known to the ancient Egyptians for their medicinal and ritual use. These plants don't grow in the open desert. They require specific, well-watered conditions. The crucial habitat for such valuable flora would have been an oasis lake, a fertile pocket in the desert where groundwater reached the surface, creating a microclimate lush enough to support a specialized botanical garden. These oasis lakes were not just sources of water, they were living pharmacies carefully tended and protected for the rare resources they nurtured. The climate history of North Africa suggests a grim fate for many such oases. As the region aridified over millennia, the water table dropped. An oasis lake cut off from its underground source would have dried up. The lush fringe of vegetation would have withered, and with it the unique plants that grew nowhere else. The specific source of a revered medicinal substance would have simply ceased to exist. The memory, however, would not die. It would have traveled along trade routes in the form of stories, tales of a magical drug from a far-off lake that could no longer be found. By the time Homer composed his epic, perhaps centuries after the lake's disappearance, the real place had faded into legend. All that remained was the story of its extraordinary gift, a story so powerful it was woven into the greatest journey ever told. The mythical lake of Nepenthes shows us how the loss of a real, physical resource, a single medicinal plant from a specific shore, can be transfigured by time into pure literary magic. The geography vanishes, but its legacy becomes immortal, a phantom lake whose waters soothe heroes in a poem long after the last drop evaporated in the desert sun. The most profound vanishings are those no human eye ever witnessed. Far to the south, beneath miles of crushing ice, lie the subglacial lakes of Antarctica, sealed away for millions of years. Ancient cultures never saw this continent, yet the human imagination has always reached for edges of the map. Could any whisper of a lost southern world have survived in myth? The philosopher Plato, in his dialogues, spoke of a vast continent opposite the known world, a great southern land he called simply Antipodes. For him, it was a philosophical counterweight, a necessary balance to the northern land. While he almost certainly had no concrete knowledge of Antarctica, his speculation taps into a deep, almost instinctual human curiosity about what lies beyond the horizon. More intriguing are the fringe theories that point to incredibly ancient maps, like the controversial Peary Rise chart from the 16th century, which seems to show a landmass where Antarctica should be, free of ice. Most scholars dismiss this as coincidence or misidentification, but the idea persists, a tantalizing what-if. Could there be a grain of truth passed down from a forgotten warm period when Antarctica was green? Modern science provides the breathtaking reality that makes such speculation so haunting. Core samples drilled from the Antarctic ice sheet and rock sediment tell an undeniable story. Around 50 million years ago, this frozen desert was a temperate rainforest. Pollen fossils reveal beech and conifer trees. Sediments show evidence of free-flowing rivers and vast freshwater lakes nestled in valleys that are now buried under unimaginable weight. This was a world of liquid water, of life, a continent that truly did have lakes and rivers. Their disappearance was not a sudden event, but a geological sigh that lasted eons. As the continents drifted and global temperatures cooled, the ice began to form. It did not come all at once, but advanced slowly, century by century, millennium by millennium. Those ancient lakes were the first to be claimed. Imagine a forest-fringed lake, its surface rippling in a cool southern breeze. Over thousands of years, the glaciers creep down from the highlands. The winters grow longer, the ice on the lake thicker, until one summer it does not fully melt. Snow accumulates, compressing into ice, and the lake is entombed. The water may still be there, trapped and kept liquid by geothermal heat and pressure, but its connection to the sun and sky is severed forever. This process repeated across the entire continent until every lake, every river, every trace of that green world was sealed under a white shroud 2 miles deep. The loss of Antarctica's lakes is the ultimate disappearance, a change of state so complete it reset an entire continent. It happened on a timescale that dwarfs human history, a slow-motion cataclysm that no civilization could have recorded. Yet the human mind, in its quest for lost worlds and forgotten ages, seems to have sensed the void at the bottom of the world, a blank space on the map that somehow felt like a memory. Perhaps our myths of southern continents are not recollections but premonitions, a subconscious recognition that the world holds secrets older than our stories, lakes lost to time so deep their only witness is the ice itself. The silence of the desert plateau is broken only by the wind and by lines that stretch to the horizon. The Nazca lines of Peru are a mystery etched on a scale meant for the gods or perhaps for something looking down from above. For decades, the focus has been on the how and the why of these vast geoglyphs, the spiders, hummingbirds, and geometric shapes scraped into the sun-baked earth. But the true secret of the Nazca might not lie in the shapes themselves, but in the empty space they occupy, a canvas that was not always so barren. This high desert was once a very different place. Geological corings have pulled up evidence of ancient paleolakes, bodies of water that shimmered in this basin long before the Nazca culture ever traced their first line. These lakes were life, the center of an ecosystem that could support human settlement. Their disappearance, driven by the brutal, cyclical swings of the El Niño Southern Oscillation, set the stage for one of humanity's most desperate and ingenious adaptations. As the lakes evaporated under a shifting climate, leaving behind only vast, flat basins of hard clay and gravel, the Nazca were presented with both a crisis and a unique opportunity. The dry lake beds, known as pampas, became their parchment. The ground here was covered in a dark layer of desert varnish iron oxide that had accumulated over millennia. By removing just the top few inches of these dark stones, they exposed the lighter, creamy soil beneath, creating a stunning contrast that has endured for centuries. But this was not an art project born from idle time. It was a profound response to a drying world. With the surface lakes gone, the Nazca turned their genius downward. They engineered the Puquillos, a stunning network of spiral-shaped aqueducts and underground tunnels that tapped into deep, subterranean aquifers. These were not just wells, they were hydrological masterpieces, using wind and pressure to bring ancient groundwater to the surface and channel it to their fields and settlements. The Puquillos were a lifeline, a technological prayer for survival, and this is where the lines and the lost lakes intertwine in a compelling theory. Many of the longest, straightest Nazca lines run perfectly parallel or converge at central points on the empty pampa. Some researchers now suggest these lines are not mere pathways or ritual circuits, but a vast, sacred diagram of the very water system that kept the Nazca alive. The straight lines could map the flow of underground water channels or point toward distant mountain peaks, the source of the precious meltwater that fed the aquifers far below. The trapezoids and rectangles might outline ceremonial plazas for water rituals or even represent symbolic fields, fertile plots drawn in the dust as a plea for the real ones to flourish. If the geoglyphs are a map, they are a map of longing, a permanent record of a hydrological network that was invisible and therefore sacred. The act of creating them, of walking these paths in ritual processions, could have been a form of sympathetic magic. By tracing the desired flow of water on the skin of the earth, they were perhaps attempting to influence its behavior in the unseen world below, to coax the precious liquid back to the surface. The animal figures take on a new meaning in this light. In Andean cosmology, animals are deeply connected to water and fertility. The hummingbird, a pollinator, brings life. The spider is associated with rain and weaving the fabric of the world. The monkey lives in the distant, watered forests of the mountains. By drawing these creatures on the dry lake bed, the Nazca may have been summoning their essence, inviting the spirits of water and fertility back into a landscape from which they had retreated. The entire Nazca plain, then, transforms from a random gallery of art into a monumental prayer book, written in lines and shapes upon the tomb of a vanished lake. Every time the rains failed and the Puquillos ran low, the community might have walked the lines again, renewing their contract with the gods of the mountains and the deep earth. The disappearance of the lake did not end their story. It compelled them to inscribe their hope directly onto the face of the desert, creating a message so large it could only be read by the very forces they sought to appease. The quiet plains north of the Black Sea were once a cradle of early farming, a fertile frontier for Neolithic communities. These people lived along the shores of a vast but landlocked freshwater lake, its waters fed by mighty rivers like the Danube and the Dnieper. This was not the Black Sea we know today. It was a smaller, isolated body of water, hundreds of feet below the level of the world's oceans. Life here was stable, predictable, and rooted to the gentle, receding shoreline as the climate slowly dried. Then the world broke. Around 7,600 years ago, rising global sea levels finally overcame the last natural dam, a rocky sill at the Bosporus. What began as a trickle soon became a roar. Salt water from the Mediterranean Sea catastrophically breached the barrier, thundering into the basin below with the force of 200 Niagara Falls. This was not a flood in a valley, it was the drowning of a continent's worth of shoreline. The freshwater lake vanished not by draining but by being violently consumed and transformed. Its original shoreline disappeared under a relentless, rising salt tide that advanced over a mile each day, swallowing the settled plains, the farm plots, and the hunting grounds of countless communities. For the people living there, this was an apocalypse in real time. You could literally watch the water rise day after day, week after week, driving you and your family, your animals, and everything you knew further and further inland until there was nowhere left to go. The stable world of the freshwater shore was erased forever, replaced by a strange, salty sea that kept expanding until it found its modern coast. The psychological impact of such an event is almost impossible to overstate. It was a trauma written across an entire region, a shared story of a world lost beneath the waves. This leads directly to one of history's most compelling questions. Could this be the seed of the Great Flood? The timing is eerily perfect. This catastrophic inundation around 5,600 years before the Common Era coincides with the dawn of complex agriculture and permanent settlements in the region, precisely the kind of societies that create and pass down foundational myths. As these traumatized populations scattered, fleeing the advancing waters, they carried the story with them. Over generations, as they migrated into Mesopotamia and Anatolia, the raw, terrifying memory of the rising sea could have evolved, merging with local river flood stories into a grander, universal narrative. The details in the Epic of Gilgamesh and later in the biblical book of Genesis are strikingly specific. A divinely sent deluge that covers the known world, with instructions to build a vessel for survival, and a final resting place on a mountain as the waters recede. These are not the details of a routine river flood. They are the hallmarks of a coastal, maritime catastrophe. A farmer used to river floods would expect the water to go down in days. But if you witnessed the Black Sea deluge, you saw the water come and never leave, permanently claiming the land. Your only frame of reference for survival would be a boat, and your salvation would indeed be found on the suddenly distant high ground. The debate among geologists continues, with some arguing the flood was more gradual. Yet the power of the hypothesis lies not in perfect scientific consensus, but in its profound human logic. It provides a plausible, physical anchor for a story so universal it appears in hundreds of cultures worldwide. Whether it was a single, dramatic event or a slower encroachment, the disappearance of that original freshwater lake and the terrifying birth of the Black Sea presented early humanity with a defining catastrophe. It taught a brutal lesson about the fragility of their world, a lesson so seismic it demanded to be told and retold, transforming a regional geological event into a cornerstone of human mythology, a warning from the deep that our world can be remade by water in an instant. The final disappearance brings us to a modern tragedy with ancient roots. The story of the Aral Sea is one of the great environmental catastrophes of the 20th century, a vast inland sea deliberately drained by Soviet irrigation projects, leaving behind a haunting graveyard of rusted ships in a desert of salt. Yet this shocking modern event is merely the latest chapter in a much older story written into the dry heart of Central Asia. Long before canals siphoned its life away, the Aral existed as part of a fragile system of endorheic lakes, bodies of water with no outlet to the ocean, existing only at the mercy of the rivers that fed them. This geography of closed basins is a landscape perpetually on the verge of vanishing. The ancient Scythian nomads who roamed these steppes and the later Chorasmian farmers who built intricate canals would have understood this fragility intimately. Their world was dotted with smaller versions of the Aral, lakes that lived and died by the whims of the Amu-Darya and Sadarya rivers, a natural river avulsion where the flow suddenly abandons one channel for another could starve a terminal lake in a generation. A community that relied on that lake for fish or irrigation would watch it shrink from a blue expanse to a chain of salty ponds and finally to a blinding white playa. The archaeological record is likely filled with the silent ruins of settlements that thrived beside lakes which are now only faint, salt-stained depressions on satellite images. The crucial difference between then and now is one of scale and speed. For the ancients, these disappearances were acts of nature, unpredictable but part of the rhythm of a harsh land. Their response was adaptation. The Scythians, as nomads, could simply move their herds to follow the water and the grasslands. The Chorasmians, as settled agriculturalists, developed that remarkable network of canals not to conquer nature, but to negotiate with it, to distribute water more evenly and perhaps buffer their oases against the loss of a single lake. Their engineering was a dialogue with an unpredictable environment. The modern tragedy of the Aral Sea represents a rupture in that ancient understanding. It was not a river changing course, but a system of monoculture demanding that the rivers be forced into a single, permanent course, channeling all their water to cotton fields. The ancient Chorasmians diverted water, but they lived within the ecological limits of their basin. The Soviet project sought to ignore those limits entirely, treating the rivers as plumbing and the sea as an acceptable casualty. The result was not a gradual change witnessed over centuries, but a collapse witnessed in decades. This contrast offers a stark lesson. The ancient disappearances taught resilience and adaptation, a knowledge encoded in nomadic routes and flexible water systems. The modern disappearance teaches the peril of seeing water as a resource to be fully controlled rather than a cycle to be carefully partnered with. The vanishing of the Aral Sea is a brutal echo of those 30 ancient disappearances, but one where the cause was not a capricious nature or a shifting climate, but a deliberate choice to forget the old lessons of a dry and delicate world. It stands as a monument to the fact that the forces that made lakes vanish in antiquity are still with us, now amplified by our own power and our own illusions of control. Across continents and millennia, a single pattern emerges from the dust. The stories of these 30 vanished lakes are far more than a catalogue of geographical curiosities. They are a testament to the profound, intimate bond between humanity and the living world. Our ancestors did not simply live on the land, they listened to it. They read its moods in the ripple of a lake's surface and felt its warnings in the retreat of a shoreline. When that water disappeared, whether in a thunderous cataclysm or a silent, creeping drought, it was not just a resource lost, it was a conversation severed, a partner in survival gone silent. This rupture forced innovation as with the minions at Lake Coppice and inspired reverence as with the Maya at their sacred cenotes. It seeded epic myths from the Black Sea to the Arabian desert, transforming raw geological trauma into stories that defined civilizations. These disappearances were the great turning points, the environmental pressures that scattered populations, rerouted trade, and compelled societies to rewrite their understanding of the cosmos itself. They reveal a planet in perpetual motion, its water endlessly cycling between sky, land, and memory. In that rhythm lies a crucial lesson for our own time. The ancient fear of a drying lake, the desperate prayers for rain carved into the Nazca Desert or offered to Andean mountain gods, are not primitive superstitions. They are early warning systems, a deep time record of humanity grappling with a changing climate. The clues to understanding our own planetary shifts might not lie solely in future projections, but in these ancient echoes of loss. The next time you look at a map, consider the spaces between the blue. What stories lie buried beneath the sand, the forest, or the city streets? What forgotten seas once defined a world? The history of our species is written in water, and its absences speak as loudly as its presence. What do you think happened to these lakes? Share your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into historical mystery.